Well, good evening, everybody. My name's Professor Kevin Verney, Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to the latest in our professorial inaugural lecture series, which also forms part of our current Festival of Ideas, and we have a full brochure of the events for that outside for you in the foyer. It does run until the middle of April, so we hope to see you again at a number of other events in the festival over the forthcoming couple of months. Our speaker this evening is Professor Tom Cockburn, who is our Head of Department of Social Sciences in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Before joining Edge Hill, Tom worked at Manchester Metropolitan University and the University of Bradford, and he has spent more than 20 years researching issues related to children and young people, and has numerous journal publications in that area, and in 2012 published a book on rethinking children's citizenship. At a time when the government is increasingly stressing the need for academic research to have impact, that is, to have measurable cultural, economic or social benefits, it should be noted that Tom has worked with the Children's Society and numerous other charities in the UK, as well as both local and national government organisations. He has also been involved in a number of European-wide projects, including youth empowerment solutions in Germany, Spain, Sweden, Italy and Hungary, and he is currently the chair of the European Sociological Association Research Network of the Sociology of Children and Childhood. Fittingly, Tom's lecture this evening will be on the subject of childhood studies, childhood sociology, and social justice. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Tom Cockburn.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. I think I recognise that person you were talking about in your introduction. Well, look, good evening, everybody, and welcome to Edge Hill if you're a visitor, and if you're already in Edge Hill, then well, welcome this evening. I've received the introduction from Kevin, which was very, very kind, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the issues that I think have really kind of where I think I am at this particular moment in my career. I've worked in and been interested in childhood studies and childhood sociology, and throughout the period I think I've had this passion for social justice. And over the last 2 years, and I think it's almost 2 years to the day since I started in Edge Hill, I've been privileged to work with some colleagues who are also really passionate about social justice in the Department of Social Sciences, and I'm really pleased to see that they've come, that a lot of them are here tonight, and a very good welcome. Although they are worryingly sitting at the back drinking, which doesn't bode well. Okay, so this is kind of almost semi-autobiographical what I'd like to talk to you about, and I just want to go back to 1970. In case people are wondering, I was 6 years old in 1970. And it's really where I think, to have an idea of where children's social justice have come, it's worth quickly glimpsing back to the past. Children in 1970 were seen but not heard. It was still that Victorian kind of notion of what children and childhood is. There was corporal punishment at school. And I remember when I was in my 4th year, and in today's money that's year 10, that I resolved not to get slippered through the month of May. I never made it. Every single school day I received a punishment for it. Mostly talking, nothing tremendously serious. We also know that there were all sorts of institutional child abuse situations and going on in the country, which we now know happened. We all had less income. And again, I'll be talking about child poverty quite a bit and social justice, but actually in 1970 we were a lot poorer. In fact, possibly all a lot poorer than we are now. It was also in a pre-digital world where a child's life was quite different. And in some respects naive, And there was, of course, rubbish toys, and I'm very grateful to Alison and Sally because they planted the remembrances of old toys, and I'm going to indulge you as well. So it's for you, Sally, Alison. It wasn't these are the games, I think, which really I had and possessed, so this is a little bit of a nostalgia for me, and they weren't that particularly good. There were some of you of the right age will recognise some of it. We have the spinning top over there, which was supposed to amuse us for a very substantial period of time. I don't think it did, but you know, there we go. The much advertised buckaroo that amused me for about 20 minutes, although I think it broke the bank for my parents to buy. And there's Lee Majors, the Bionic Man. So I had Lee Majors as a Bionic Man, so I did have a disabled toy, which was later on considered to be politically correct. This is also, I've got the Rubik's Cube. There are a few 1980s things here, but I did have a little bit of a thing about Rubik's Cubes. Some of you would recognise the other things. On the right there is the chopper, the bike of choice in the 1970s. However, I went around South London in a bike looking like that. No wonder I never got stopped by the police. But of course, these were all boys' toys, and I'm really sorry about this, but actually I can't remember what girls played with in the 1970s, so I just thought I'd like to with Farrah Fawcett Majors. There's a couple of things there that were really from the 1980s, and surely every girl would really like Stretch Armstrong and to be able to play with. What I do remember from my sisters was a subscription to Jackie and this shiny teeth gentleman, Donny Osmond, and the fashion statement of the Bay City Rollers. So hopefully there's a little bit of reminiscence for some people, but quite different from the generation of interactive computer toys, of where the online presence and world in which our children live with their tablets, their smartphones and so on is quite different. It's really more time is spent out of amusement for a lot of children during their spare time when they're not at school than for us, which was mostly spare time, some of which was spent amusing. But again, these were just an observation. The other observation I would like are some of these things, which I did remember loving on the buses as a child. And also something which now I think I'm warming to really is Paul Daniels. That's a magic set, not a toupee set that he had in there, which I'm obviously more interested in now, and it looks as if Bruce Forsyth was interested in the toupees, and so indeed with Donald Trump. But on the whole, these were the kind of games, and gives an idea of just how possibly grim it was in 1970. In terms of television, I had to have Play School for Alison as well, and look, I wanted Floella and Derek Griffiths in the shot. However, I couldn't find one with those two and Brian Cant, unless Brian Cant is behind Nick Robertson's hair, hiding underneath. Another thing probably my staff will tell you, I do like a nice shirt, and Peter Purves has got a particularly nice shirt on there. But again, these were some of the television programmes that we watched, which I astonished my children only lasted for 2 hours a day. And again, they don't believe that there was a time when you could turn the television on after 7 in the morning and before 7 at night without there being a number of television channels. But what I want to talk about after this kind of little bit of a brief excursion is childhood studies, a little bit of context of what that is. And I think childhood studies originates, I would suggest, it's not controversial, but from Stanley Hall's child study movement in the early 20th century, where he looked to accumulate evidence around looking at children and childhood at the time as an object of study, an object of an academic study. And in the 1960s, I think rather similar to African American and women's studies that became an academic department, that childhood studies became very much associated, I think, with a political struggle. And certainly for the childhood studies that I've been interested in is a political movement. Childhood studies is interdisciplinary. It consists of sociology, which I'm going to talk a bit about, education, but also social anthropology, history, which I think in my original PhD thesis was a historical study of the child protection systems in Manchester in 1870. And I think it was a really good way of understanding the problems and conditions which were around in 1870 around the operation of child protection, which still, I think, bedevils the way in which our country responds to child abuse. It was, in 1870, there were competition between nurses, social workers, or they wouldn't have called themselves that, doctors, lawyers, a whole variety of professions that were competing about the child and objects of knowledge of the child. And today we have inquiries that systematically say if only professionals can get on well together. Well, in 1870 these professions developed in competition with each other. So the chance of getting them to merge together is quite difficult. There are also, I think, in terms of interdisciplinarity, geography, psychology, economics, medicine, social policy, law, pedagogy, art, literature. I can go on actually about other things which characterise childhood studies. But it's also, I think, worth noting the European development of childhood studies in Scandinavia and Central Europe, which looked at that as a genuinely interdisciplinary study, which was very much associated with social pedagogy, about more than just studying children, but how to improve and engage with the lives of children. And childhood studies made a distinction between studying children. People have always studied children. They've always been an object of knowledge as long as science has been developing. They've been interested in the reproduction of the population. But what childhood studies was interested in was childhood and the way in which society constructs the experience of our children in our societies. It also made a distinction with studying early childhood as opposed to this generic thing with childhood, which still, I think, bedecks childhood studies. When does it start? Does it start with birth? Does it start with pre-birth? Does it end at 18? Does it end at 15? Does it end at 25? Does it end at when when someone becomes independent? And if it's that, then I think they're still going to be probably in their 30s. But the idea is that it contains quite a lot of different experiences of childhood within that. It also, I think, has a link with the children's rights movement, and I'm not talking much about the children's rights movement, but perhaps asking questions about the context of what gives rise to that. And as Alison and Adrian James have stated, childhood studies is about extending our knowledge of childhood and its complexities. When we talk about children and childhood, we're not talking about a homogeneous group, and it's that complexity that becomes interesting. For me, there are a number of significant moments in childhood, in the sociology of childhood, and this really, I think, reflects my learning journey, that when I started my PhD studies in 1991, these were the significant studies which I felt kind of really shapes the viewpoint in which I'm going to understand social justice and citizenship. I'll come to each of these in turn, but I think I'm going to have a particular moment of saying the James Jenks and Prout collection, which was published in 1990, which was an edited collection which I think changed the world and how I thought about children and childhood. All of those did, and I'll be coming back to pretty much all of these studies later on, mentioning all these people. But the sociology of childhood is quite different from childhood studies. And the sociology of childhood, I think, has fed into childhood studies in a number of ways, but diverges in a number of ways in terms of its focus. The first main contribution of the sociology of childhood is social constructionism. Childhood today is remarkably different than it was in any other historical period. It changes according to cultures. It is not a natural state. The children may be a natural state, but childhood isn't. The interpretation and experience of that is socially constructed. Therefore, sociology has developed a number of methodologies around this, macro and micro methods, ethnographic studies, sociolinguistics, a number of methodologies in which to understand children. And I was reminded earlier on today of the Weberian notion of Verstehen, in which the importance of understanding and getting into the worlds of children. And in particular, this was something which I think is still developing, but we still know very little about, is the peer cultures of children. What is a child's everyday experience? What is the world of the everyday? There's lots of information and studies about child abuse, education, leisure of children, sport of children, but actually how that is experienced on an everyday basis is not explored, or hasn't been until sociology is beginning to build up the literature. We also, from sociology, have central children and cultural identity as a central understanding. And also, from sociology, I think we gain an understanding of the otherness of children and children as the other. That we understand how children are created as different from the rest of humanity through adult attitudes. Children are the only people that we treat differently on a number of levels which no other adult is treated in. They are incomplete. They are subject to stereotypes, fear of children and fear for children. And on the fear of children, I can remember being involved in a meeting with people involved in the Welsh Assembly in the early 2000s, the group of politicians and civil servants, very powerful men, and when I was putting to them that a group of children were coming to meet them, were terrified. How do we act with them? What do we do? What do we do? So there are these men in suits, ironically, who were terrified. So what's that all about? Also, I think sociology is important because it analyses voice, and there's a lot of literature around participation and listening to children's voice, and sociology problematises that. There's also the development of social theory. We study, which is the study of relational processes, of not just looking at individuals as a contained unit, but what happens in between. What is the relationship between children, their parents, their peers, and so on? And also from sociology, has moved on from the functionist view of the family as serving a function of socialising children into something which treats children in a more dynamic way. Socialisation theory has this blank object called a child in which we pour in experiences to grow a complete adult. Well, given the complexities of childhood, we understand that to be quite wrong. We also realise that we as adults develop and grow in different ways, both physically and mentally and so on. So from this passive object of a child that needs socialising, we've got this notion of individualisation. How do other notions of social identities come into the world of children? And also we have, I think this is very, very strongly illustrated with the child carers literature that's coming out from social policy by Miri Song and Saul Becker, where children are the people that are holding the family together. That without the children's caring capacity, that a significant number of adults and children will not be able to function in society. So this is inverting the traditional notion of the family of which children are the object of care towards recognising children as being the subject of providing care. We have the intersections with gender, culture, ethnicity, class, disability and so on. And also from the sociology of childhood, I think we've got the very interesting thing, which again uses that word, which I'll come back to shortly towards the end, around recognition, is rethinking what work is. And here Jens Kortrup, Virginia Morrow, Panther Brick and Manfred Liebel's really pioneering work about challenging the assumption that all child labour is wrong by saying, well, actually, there's a number of ways that could be challenged. Firstly, what are children doing between 9 and 3 or 9 and 4 while they attend school other than work? What are children doing when they're doing their chores other than work? What is a child doing, an older sister doing, when she looks after her younger brother while the mum pops out or dad pops out for to the shops, other than work? Children work and work all the time, and we need to recognise and rethink that. And also we know from Manfred Liebel's really challenging studies around programs to stop child labour in the developing world, that is not what the children who are working want. And again, maybe we should think about actually protecting all workers, and that would include children rather than picking them out as a special case. We also from sociology understand power as disciplinary, that actually power operates on children in terms of enforcing conformity or other forms of behaviour, and that power isn't something that drops down from heaven on someone, from the skies on someone, but it is in a capillary manner. It's everywhere, it saturates us, it's in the everyday. Power operates even in our quietest moments, even in our reflective times when we think to ourselves, as Foucault and Nicholas Rose argue, that's the operation of power. It happens everywhere. From Mannheim and Lena Elanen's work is also to think about generation and a generational order. We understand that there's a gender order. We understand that there's a class order. And the challenging thing really is around looking at how generations operate. Society moves according to when a group of people who share an age grow up together, develop together, marry in a form of generation, have children of their own, reach positions of power and retirement. There's a case of a dynamic movement of history according to generations, and yet very often that plays a very marginal role in a lot of thought. And I think for me the main contribution from sociology, although I think possibly they'll see Nancy Fraser and Axel Honneth will not see themselves as sociology, is the really interesting debates around social recognition and redistribution. You need to recognise people's contribution in order to redistribute resources in society. Nancy Fraser argues that that's a continuum that must go together. If you redistribute wealth, for example, with people who do not have social recognition, it will end up into a poor position. And I'll come back to that shortly. There are other moments, I think, in developing my thought that I think are for me were very significant. There are some I'm going to choose here. I've not put in various education acts. I've not included other things which may, of course, have been very significant moments in understanding the development of children and childhood. But I think it's what I really want to kind of emphasize is that point in 1989 where I entered university and became obsessed, if you like, with the sociological understanding of childhood. And 1980, that late 80s and early 90s was a very significant time because it had these two, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child 1989 and the Children Act of 1989, which moved the goalposts in terms of social policies with children, in my view, that we had to listen to children. And children had a language of rights. And that was a very significant moment from when, from the 1970s, where children's rights was seen as something cranky and mad. Some corners of this country, it's still considered cranky and mad. But in 1985, the Gillett case had recognised that children, or some children, could have the competence to make decisions about contraception on their own rights without the need for parental authority. The Cleveland inquiry was the first one for me. I know there were previous kind of child abuse inquiries, but the Cleveland inquiry around child sexual abuse really put that on the map of where the sexual abuse of children was happening in a large context. It also began the narrative of blaming social workers, but anyhow. But again, I don't think the fact that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Children Act both happened in 1989. What happened in this period that gave rise to those particular moments? I'd really love to give you a very erudite answer to that. And I have been at conferences where people have tried to think about what happened in 1989 that develops this notion, as Lorraine Fox Harding argued, initiated the children's rights perspective on social policies. And I think it's probably a number of things around social movements, a mood of the time, around a whole variety of ways in which people communicate, the fact that parents and adults were spending more time with children. We don't know for sure, but something happened then. And when in 1992, 91, 92, I began my PhD study, and I think another significant moment in childhood was the James Bulger murder and the reaction to it, and where I was shocked that actually human rights and the fact that children are something separate the rule book was thrown into the bin and changed. And that was, for me, very, very worrying, as well as the ostracism of Thompson and Venables, and the shock that children do horrible things. Well, actually, we've all been through childhood. We do know that children do horrible things, as do adults do horrible things. But the Bulger murder really became a media event. The other moment, which I don't know whether people would remember who were around in the early 90s, was another case which moved me quite a bit, was the Laura Davis liver transplant case between 1992. And for those who don't know Laura Davis, she was a 4-year-old girl who was very, very poorly, and there was a campaign for her to raise money for her to have a liver transplant at the University of Pennsylvania. And that was very significant because in 1993 I'd read a book around the history of child study and what they did in the University of Pennsylvania in the 1930s was collect black children, irradiate them, expose them to irradiation and other illnesses to conduct experiments on them. And it looked as if there was this child that was suffering, that was being sent over towards these kind of people that were giving this pioneering treatment. And I felt a little bit uncomfortable with that this kind of process where this child's voice, I think, was just entirely passive and an entire victim. And I just wanted to hear Laura's voice, and I thought it never actually came across in any of the coverage. But anyhow, I digress on that. The other significant moment, which is a big jump, but I think no less a significant change, was the publication in 2007 of a report by UNICEF called Child Poverty in Perspective, and I've come on to that shortly. The United Nations also, in 2008, produced another less high-profile reports on the Children's Commissioner's report on the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which shamed the UK government on the storage of children's DNA, the age of criminal responsibility, which by international standards was brought down to a very low level, calls for a reduction of children in custody, and castigated the use of physical restraint that was going on as a matter in a number of young offender institutes in very, very internationally illegal ways. But I'm going to go back to the 2007 UNICEF report, and it gave us this, which, for those who are followers of English sport, pretty much summarises it, because there we are at the bottom of some indicators on children's well-being. And these well-being measurements were material well-being, health and safety, educational well-being, family and peer relationships, behaviours and risks, and subjective feelings of well-being. The UK appeared last on that list in terms of reports from the Innocenti study in Italy, behind the United States, Hungary, Portugal, Austria, the Czech Republic, and so on. We expect them to come behind, you know, the Netherlands, Sweden, and the likes of those countries. But for me, I think a lot of people were quite shocked and surprised by that, and gave rise to a number of significant moments. Now, those who work with me will know that I'm colourblind, but apparently this has got red, green, and yellow. And the UK is there with quite a lot of red. It's not quite, you know, I think we've gone up a little bit on this measurement, and there have been, to be fair, there have been some improvements on the UK's performance, but not much. What this meant, this study, was it recognised what a lot of us thought, that kids in the UK are really rather unhappy. And this unhappiness is very, very significant. They're on one level, they kind of have wealth and lots of other kind of things, but feel really, really sad. And there are other things about the UK around social justice, which are also very, very important. 2.6 million children in the UK are in absolute low-income measure. 2.6 million children, which rises, and I'm going to bang on about this a little bit, is 3.7 million this rises to after housing costs. People have incomes, a large proportion in some parts of the country are housing costs. Those who know the South East would understand that, but other aspects of the country, including the North West, would understand that. To put that 3.7 million into context, that's 28% of children, or if you're in a classroom of 30 children, 9 of them are in absolute low-income measure, in poverty. 60% of children in the bottom quintile of income in the UK are in material deprivation. And what does this mean? Well, it means being cold, going hungry, not being able to join in activities, not going on a holiday, the inability to buy 25 or more 100 basic household items. A quarter of basic household items are unable to be afforded. In terms of workless households, 70% of households are in material deprivation. Particularly stark for children of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin, seems to be the ethnic group that has the highest proportion. Another slide that shows this, which probably some of those of us who are parents would understand, is that as a group of the bottom, well, basically single with children tends to be the group in the bottom fifth of our population have been experiencing most poverty. Couples without children, a little bit, you know, basically this slide shows how bloody expensive children are, I think, you know, and the way that they make us poor, which again wouldn't come to surprise as parents. The other thing that I want to show about this graph is, first of all, there has been this decline in child poverty. This goes from 98, but that's a graph that's been going down consistently to the 70s and flattening off around about the early mid-2000s. Now, what I'm going to do is show you the difference, the before. This is before housing costs, and that's after housing costs, rising from round about 25, round about 20% living in low income, in poverty. Oh, that's gone too far. Going up to 30%, 10% difference around housing costs. This, I think, kind of shows this what brings this point out quite well, because The part of the world that I come from is inner London, and that's always the bar on the left, the dark shade, is the raw level of child poverty. The lighter shade next to it is after housing costs. So if you take housing costs into account, most poor children, the biggest proportion of children live in inner London. The second one is outer London. And again, if we look at the children in poverty before housing costs, it's one of the affluentest areas of the country, but with housing costs pulls a lot of children into poverty. So again, this idea of what we make, decisions that we make about children and the experience of children is quite significant. There are other forms of social justice which are also apparent in the UK. Here we have the number of GCSEs, or 5 or more GCSEs that are achieved by children on leaving school, and we see that the ones that are eligible for free school meals, a rather vulgar measure I admit, tower above those who are not entitled to free school meals. There are ethnic differences, of course, but nothing compared to the differences around poverty. So again, we don't want to have the stereotypes of how ethnic minorities are always poor. Yes, they stand more of a chance of that. But the important thing is around the idea of income and materiality and social justice and educational achievement. And nowhere, I think, I've got this another slide here for you, which is readiness of school at 3 years old, vocabulary at 3, vocabulary at 5, conduct problems and hyperactivity. This is going from the poorest to the richest groups of society. If it was school readiness at 3, if there was a problem and it was just individual families that were at fault, then you'd have one group down there below and then everyone else more or less bunched together. What's interesting is the way that this is graded in a nice linear graph to income. So the more income you have, the more school readiness. So how does that happen? How does the mechanics of that operate? And similarly, conduct problems, you've got that kind of drop. You'd expect poorer children at the bottom to have conduct problems and hyperactivity and all the rest of the other kind of definitions, but not in such a graded response. And again, Kate Pickett, I think, who was speaking here last night, has written and published demonstrating this kind of notion of association with income and social justice. In other ways is health income, and again, I think I could go on quite a lot. I'm beginning to run a little bit out of time for what I want to do, but again, the figures are grim. A child in the lowest class is twice as likely to die before the age of 15 than a child from the well-off home. A child from the lowest class is 9 times more likely to die in a house fire. At any one time, 1/5 of children and adolescents experience psychological problems. While mortality has markedly decreased over the last century, we're seeing this bottoming out, and we're seeing a rise of particular diseases, including respiratory diseases, asthma, and emotional problems. We also have a difference of the experience of disabled children who, families of disabled children have only 78% of the resources of all families. There's an element of poverty there, and yet it costs 3 times more to bring up a child with a disability than a child without a disability. This is really, really significant. Another really important study, I think, which I was privileged to be seeing, I wasn't involved with in the University of Bradford, was bringing this down to children's lives. And what the Born in Bradford study did, it registered every single baby that was born in a particular year. I think it was 2006. But I might be wrong there. So every single baby that was born in the Bradford district was registered and followed up with a questionnaire every year. In the first was the number of children that died, hence the infant mortality rate. Little Horton district in Bradford, which was one of the poorest area ward in Bradford, had 9.1 deaths per 1,000 live births. In Ilkley, which is still part of Bradford, there has not been a recorded case of infant mortality and therefore doesn't exist. sure there's a chance of it doing. So from a ride of a 6:40 bus that you get from Little Horton out to Ilkley, you have such a grave difference in a very important outcome for children. 9.1 deaths per one live births. To give you a bit of context, the UK rate is 4 deaths per 1,000. In Sweden, it's 2. So putting this in another way, Little Horton has the same infant mortality rate as Jamaica and Moldova. I'm sure Jamaica and Moldova also has its versions of Ilkley, but you get the point. And I can never say this without kind of having almost a kind of something in my throat. Between 60 and 70 babies die every year in Bradford. And childhood studies has got and social justice is crucial in my view. There's also some notions and measurements of subjective well-being, and I'm going to really apologise because I do want to have some time for questions afterwards. These are the things, I'm going to start off with the first two. There's lots of indicators around subjective well-being. It's feelings of unhappiness, but also the ability to integrate sadness into one's life and be able to deal with it. And feeling secure in social relations. What we have within subjective well-being is the sociological comfort that we have as human beings. These are what we are. We are who we are, happy or we are unhappy in terms of our relationships. And there's some really good stuff around subjective well-being in children's, around the Children's Society Good Childhood Study, Jonathan Bradshaw's work, and also Six Smith's. But I'll go into that other than bring the point, again, the UK comes out really bad with this. Our children aren't happy. And another one which is worth doing is, this is from the British Medical Journal, but I think again Kate Pickett's work and Wilkinson's work has brought this out very well. These are the studies that we've got: material well-being, and we've also got levels of inequality, 10 being the highest level of inequality, 2 being the lowest, 0.5 being the highest measure of well-being, -1 being the lowest. So we have those with the least inequality: Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, experiencing good well-being. Japan being a little bit of an exception there. And then we get to the United States of America, almost plotted along this graph. Then we have Israel, and a really strange case of New Zealand. I've got no idea why this, because that's actually not that unequal society. And UK, they're right at the bottom in terms of measures of subjective well-being, and it's also quite unequal. So a big connection there. Health and safety, of course, the UK performed its best in that, and it's seen a child mortality has declined, and all the point I'm going to make is that health and safety experience has changed. Child suicides have declined, fortunately, but are flattening. There are more reported increased cases of sexual assaults and rape, and also reporting of abuse and cruelty. Now, this may be just around reporting of those issues, of course. We also have concerns about children's online safety and the child protection systems and mechanisms that we have. The reason I think it's worth pointing out is that, again, UK doesn't do tremendously well comparatively, but also to bring out that these health and safety issues are gender and poverty related. What I'd like to do now is to focus really on how we understand that. And the way I want to do that is to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of understanding that, linking this back to the sociology of childhood, and also my work, I think. And I'm going to do this in terms of understanding children's social rights, civil rights, look at the concept of social justice, and instead advocate that actually what we need to have is a new understanding of children's citizenship based upon their lived lives, generational justice, and social recognition. Starting with universal welfare, well, since 1945 we've got a welfare state. We have free education. In 1945, in the Beveridge Report, the idea was that everyone would have a minimum standard of living. What we've seen recently is a shift in welfare policy, where at the bottom, this is garnered from an Australian journal, so it has things like the Commonwealth and non-governmental organisations, but this is the same policy directive in the UK too. At the bottom pyramid, universal preventative initiatives to support all families and children. These are the entitlements that we should all have. Okay, then it goes up to early intervention services, targeted services for at-risk families and children, and the statutory system being a tiny little point of that pyramid. The point I'm going to make about the changes in the welfare system is that these services have been challenged and are almost disappearing or being eroded through inflation. These are now subject towards cutbacks as well. And what we're having is a welfare state that's more targeted towards children at heavy end risk, and the big safety net that's affecting us all is being removed away from us. And that's part of the problem with social rights and a trend that's quite worrying. Children's rights, I talked about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's a formidable document, and you can all read every single word of those, can't you? Out of that. I'm going to point out a couple of them. Article 12, children's right to participation. There's also, I'm going to read it out because I know you won't be able to read this, is Article 15, which I've written about quite a lot, and it is the children's right to associate. And the Article 15 says this: children have the right to meet with other children and young people and to join groups and organisations. Great, that's a human right that we should all have. Except for, this is the only article as well in the UN conventions, as long as this does not stop other people from enjoying their rights. Don't know about you, but that's a strange little expression of a right, of children's rights. As, yeah, you can associate, as long as you're not going to be associated troubling anyone else. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, I'm a passionate advocate of it and really, really support it. However, it has some important problems. It's universalistic. It doesn't, when it talks about rights to privacy, to dignity, to health, to educational services and so on, it's all universalistic. It doesn't quite match the realities of a lot of countries across the globe. It's very, very Western oriented. It also recognised discrimination. You can't discriminate a child according to her gender or their disability or their cultural group, but it doesn't recognise discrimination of adults against children. It also, when you read the right to a family life, that actually it has quite a lot of elements of control of women providers of care in its ambiguous use of the family. Well, we all know that when a lot of policy documents talk about family responsibilities, they really mean mothers' responsibilities. Particularly in the developing world, this leads to big tensions of control over women. It presents children as the objects of protection rather than subjects in their own lives. It has little attention to the context of rights in living with children's lives with siblings, parents, and so on. So if you're looking at expressing rights for a child to education, then what does this mean in terms of younger children, parents' obligations, and so on? The expressions of the rights, as in the UN Convention and other conventions of rights, of course, is that they're adversarial. They're against holders of other rights. It also reinforces Western scientific practices of developmental psychology. And for Philip there, I'm going to put that there. I know developmental psychology's moved on quite a bit since then, but it still holds an extremely powerful sway, and also has an object that with development that you're developing from something other into something complete. And it has that within the UN Convention. It also doesn't challenge the kind of notion that the increasing neurological understanding of children as this bundle of of nerve optic fibres, particularly in the early years, rather than thinking human beings. And of course, it reinforces the otherness of children as a special case, and that can be difficult. On the other hand, I've got that. Children are, of course, recognised as serious social actors and have various rights to privacy, dignity, equal treatment, and I love the right to privacy is something I think should be advertised more. Children's privacy has been ignored in a lot of contexts in my daily life that I see, you know. It also can be used as a tool to tackle widespread abuses of children, identifies failures of national governments, clear set of standards in which to aspire, and provide an important point of comparison. I won't talk too much about social justice because actually the social justice hasn't got many definitions or competing definitions. It's almost an assumption, and I've talked a lot about the indicators around education, poverty and so on is around social justice. But I'm going to give you a UN definition, social justice is an underlying principle for peaceful and prosperous coexistence, their emphasis, not mine, within and amongst nations. We uphold the principles of social justice when we promote gender equality or the rights of indigenous people and migrants. We advance social justice when we remove barriers that people face because of gender, age, race, ethnicity, religion, cultural disability. And of course, few of us can argue against such a kind of statement. The International Labour Organization, however, produced a document around fair social justice for a fair globalization. And it's a lovely document, actually, because what it actually advocates is stuff which is almost kind of fairly anachronistic. It has this tripartite system, government, employers and workers' representatives. I mean, I can always imagine Harold Wilson popping out of number 10 and having beer and sandwiches at such a notion. Doesn't really reflect neoliberalism, but anyhow. Fundamental values of freedom, human dignity, social justice, security and non-discrimination. To have productive, profitable and sustainable enterprises together with a strong social economy. And it says the elimination of all forms of forced or compulsory labour, the effective abolition of child labour and the elimination of discrimination. The reason I've talked about this document is because it's the only UN document that actually mentions children in any of this idea of social justice. And that was in the context of the effective abolition of child labour. Well, I think my 14-year-old doing his paper round would object to that, as I think a lot of working children do. However, the elimination of all forms of forced and compulsory labour for anyone must be stopped and abolished. So why child labour is different, I'm not quite sure. I'm going to talk about citizenship, which I've probably made my reputation of, if I can use that word. And I think citizenship has got a really bad press, if you like, because actually it's a very useful way of understanding the process of where children are today. It illustrates the struggle for membership and participation in community. I would advocate that it analyses the decision-making processes and operations of power, and one can importantly read off those who are more marginalised. And the seminal work of this was T.H. Marshall's Citizenship and Social Class, where he identified civil, political and social citizenship. Civil citizenship happened in the 18th century with the identification of the recognition of the person's right to represent themselves in a court of law, to be a person. 19th century, political rights to the vote, and the 20th century of social citizenship to a basic welfare. So he had this idea of ameliorating capitalism through the welfare state and premised on the notion of rights with responsibilities. However, of course, there are a number of problems with Marshall's idea. It was never quite as simple as they actually thought. The welfare state has never been a unified government plan, if you like. It's always had tensions within it, discursive struggles and disagreements, limitations, as I think the National Health Service has shown that actually it still has a private sector. There's also the increasing use of conditionalism over absolute rights to an income. It's all has been used exclusively to keep ethnic minorities and women within particular social positions. And of course, for children, as most of the sociology of childhood and history of childhood have shown, it's a way of the professional gaze on the lives of children. So this is the book in which I advocate for a slightly different model. And instead, drawing from Gerard Delanty, is one where a citizenship which isn't around these abstract notions. Well, first of all, if we're looking at civil and political rights, children can't vote, still can't vote. They don't have political rights. They don't have responsibility to represent themselves in a court of law and are unable to write contracts, so do not have civil citizenship. And their social citizenship is marked by all these other kind of caveats. But lived citizenship emphasises not rights, all the subsequent responsibilities, duties, entitlements, this idea that you can balance these things up. So we'll give you some welfare as long as you have the responsibility to behave yourself. Instead, that's not the point of what citizenship should be about. It should be about voice, about how you can express yourself, as those subjective measurements had, how you feel as though you're being listened to, how you feel as though you belong. It should be based upon difference and, of course, social justice. It needs to be inclusive, based around negotiations and interactions that develop symbolic, cognitive, and social competencies. We feel as though where we belong socially, according to a process of time, where we develop those symbolic, cognitive, and social understandings. It needs to enhance the individual sense of belonging, and those who deviate from this sense of belonging must be recognised equally. In fact, perhaps recognising for them for the difference in what they offer as being different and that being good. And face-to-face associated learning processes in interactions with people develop social trust. So this inclusive notion of lived citizenship is something which we should aspire to. But also the lived citizenship and attention to the lived citizenship that children and adults indeed experience also alert us to the disciplinary processes, the process of conditionality, which people are entitled to welfare, over what circumstances, why are people not entitled to these things or included in these things. We can look at the developments in the flows of regulation, the way that regulations interact with our daily lives and children's daily lives, and how power operates in a capillary-like manner. So we need to understand how people have a sense of who they are in a very detailed manner, but also to understand how power operates on people in a very detailed very detailed and specific and small-scale manner. We need to look at, this could be evidence when we look at structures that children have, everyday interactions that children have with structures. We can look at formal politics, how children see that, and contrast that with the mundane politics of children's everyday lives. Children's lives, like all our lives in their everyday, are political aspects. They deal with power, they negotiate power. It's not just through the formal processes that this happen. As Callio and Halley argue, it's through webs of power relations in their own political geographies. The power they negotiate with parents, with peers, with teachers, with bus drivers, I was talking about earlier, and so on and so forth. We can contrast, when we pay attention to this aspect of citizenship, we can look, as what I say, as invited spaces. The representations of children's voices become stripped of their criticality and stabilised into norms of good conduct. The school council is less around how children can look to express themselves and their voice and their belonging than into something which is around norms and good conduct. Looking at the complexity and fluid nature in which children construct their identities draws attention to children's intentions. What do they mean? What do they mean when we need to look and understand how children intend to shape their social relations and circumstances. And importantly, when I've been consulting with children, and I've quite recently had a call from the BBC on how to best get children to talk about issues of the day that concern them, and what activity should we have. Well, I said to them, which I think was the wrong answer because they didn't ring back, I just said, you just leave them on their own. Just give them the space to talk about things amongst themselves and they will arrive at that. Do you know what? Children do construct things in a very, very constructive and insightful way if given the space. It also happens on their own terms rather than hijacking on adult agendas. We can see this as Sonia Livingston and Nunes Almeida's work. When we look at their online spaces, they are concerned with very, very serious matters. So the process of citizenship is, we can see this from more when we're looking more at their lived experiences in a number of ways. We can see a number of tensions with citizenship. Sticking together may be a cause of social exclusion, cultural fossilization and social stratification. Having bonds of communication of where people bond in networks excludes people. A group of friends, a group of colleagues only exists as a group because others are excluded. And that's important to know and to map in terms of looking at process of citizenship. We also know from Gilchrist and Cipriano that networks lead to opportunities but also constraints. We also, when beginning to look at children's lived citizenship, that we can critique the human capital perspective. As Jens Kortrup has said, children as human becomings under the things like the workfare approach, that children's role is to prepare themselves for being citizen workers. And this can be identified in some of the educational choices, that the educational curriculum is entirely future-oriented, not entirely, but mostly, I should say, future-oriented. How they're going to achieve their 5 GCSEs or above. A very, very narrow curriculum with very, very, very few spaces around developing shared values, harmony and community. Instead, I think, looking at lived citizenship following Honneth, we can see children belong to a class of morally responsible persons and are therefore rights bearers entitled to respect. That children are people with talents and capabilities who contribute in society in a variety of ways. So, linking this up to social justice, exploring the lived citizenship for children in their own right allows for an appropriate focus on context and environment and needs to do that. A focus on children's lived citizenship must look at practices of recognition, non-recognition, when children's contributions are recognised and when they're not, which has been their work, what kind of actions the children do, which we know they do quite a lot of caring for themselves and others. We also know, if I can give other examples of non-recognition, is the money in which they earn as pocket money, which isn't seen as a kind of generation of earnings, but is seen as something of a learning tool for something to perfect for when they're older. And also non-recognition of children is something which you can almost see the absence of. And Priscilla Alderson has done some very good work about the absences as being saying more than actually the existence of things. When we look at the absences of children from our city centres, and if you look at a photograph of a city centre, the chances are it doesn't contain a child, unless it's with an adult. And if you contrast that with the paintings of Louis Bruegel in earlier periods where children were everywhere. So what does that say about what we want? Where do we want children? Where are they? Tucked away somewhere safely, I would suspect. But it's the idea of not recognising where they are. And also this idea of we need to have a process of redistribution, and redistribution of all things, monetary, but also where does this redistribution occur? Is it just financial redistribution, or is it recognitive redistribution too? So when we look at self-realisation and social engagement, when we look on children's participation, is the object rather than this individualised notion of participation. The point of asking children what they think, of expressing their voice, has to be around children's own self-realisation and social engagement, rather than, I don't know, the way of identifying, you know, how to keep the bathroom, the toilets clean in school, and so on and so forth. Interestingly, I think, and perhaps more importantly about looking at citizenship as a learning process, is that it's the learning processes of all of us, not just children. And I think what I've been more concerned with now is when we're looking to set up projects around children's participation, it's very often about focusing on how children can learn to participate. I like to turn that round and look at how adults learn how to facilitate that participation. How are they learning from children on children's own participation? And also, of course, it's about placing children's rights in their own consciousness, and about making children not just aware of their rights as such, but in terms of what rights should be. And also, if we're looking at social justice, we need to focus on intergenerational interdependencies and capabilities of the givers and recipients of care. The process of parents just giving, and I know as parents we feel as though it's just giving, but actually that's not a reality. Children give too, and it's a rewarding experience. And this idea that that's just in terms of the emotions, if you like, but also there are ways in which generations interact with each other financially as well. Okay, we also need to look at more on sustainability rather than economic growth, and for professionals to work with the capabilities of all. Looking at the future, childhood studies must look at the confronting child poverty. It needs to do this particularly in the developed and developing countries. We need to work with the disciplines of economics and international relations. Both of those subjects actually have not been very forthcoming with understanding children. We need to look at process of migration and the movement of children. And I think when we're looking at lived citizenship, if we're looking at the process of how we understand social justice, this idea of a static child going from home to school is not good enough. It's about, we need to see things about movement. Children move, they move schools, they move areas, they move countries. We need to look at that process. A lot of the children's days spent in transport systems, be it the car, bus, or whatever. We do need to remove the barriers of gender, age, race, ethnicity, religion, culture, or disability, but children's experiences are important to all of these, and of course it is to age, but in order to understand the barriers that women, ethnic minorities, religious minorities, and so on experience, children's experiences in that are important. There's need to focus on the everyday lives of children and the interaction with larger structures. And also I think it's not happened very much at all. 2008, we've had various welfare reforms. Very little of them have focused on children. How have children fared under this latest recession? Very, very few of us know, because few of us are asking those questions. And also I think an attention to childhood is important, because there's lots of work on transitions between childhood and adulthood. People are particularly interested in youth. There's a whole larger discipline than the sociology of childhood is the sociology of youth. There's far more academics involved in it, far more money. But actually, the more important elements that lead to those transitions happen earlier. It happens earlier in childhood, and the knowledge that we have on that is unimportant. I'm going to leave you with a notice about Edge Hill, really. childhood and interdisciplinary research and includes all of those. And that's pretty much every single department apart from 2 sections at the university, which is business. I can't remember what the other one is, but it'll come to me soon, which I couldn't think would make a contribution to childhood studies. So I think Edge Hill and my privilege of working here really is part of what I think is a really exciting stage of where we can take some of these agendas forward. So I thank you for your attention.
Well, Tom has kindly agreed to take some questions before we break for refreshments. So if anyone does have any questions, I'm sure there are plenty of things you want to ask Tom. If you can raise a hand. But I just ask that before you start asking the question, if you can wait for our handheld mic to get to you, so that what you have to say is recorded clearly in the film that we're making this evening. So, any questions, anyone?
My friend Philip.
your office neighbour. Tom, congratulations and thank you for an excellent lecture this evening. Now, if I may be very predictable, I noticed actually the other department you've missed there is biology. And I was just going to, not that I have any mandate for my colleagues there, but going back to what you were saying about the UN Convention, the Rights of the Child. Yes, I understand from my perspective in the more biomedical aspects of psychology, I understand entirely what you're saying about social construction of childhood. But neurobiological maturation is also something that has an existence independently of how we construct it. I don't see the conflict then between those disciplines that you mentioned from the neuroscientific perspective. I don't see the conflict between them. And then what you were saying in a later slide about citizenship and developing competencies in cognition, amongst other things. Of course, cognition is a word that would stand out. So is there essentially a conflict, or is it just that perhaps we're not used to bringing those perspectives together?
I think there's 2 elements of that. Yes, I mean, we all, children and adults, have cognitive development, and I learn things, and I know you learn things too, Philip, as well. And that's something that's part of that. And we are biological people, all of us in this room. We have neurons; they are a reality, but they don't define us as persons. And what I think the problem I had with the UN Convention is that it's around focusing on childhood as an identity, as being an other. Now, if that other and that identity has been identified entirely by their biological and neurological arrangements, well, don't know about you, but there are differences between lots of people in this room and our biological and neurological arrangements, but we're not treated differently. And I think that's where I think the complexity, the problem with identifying children entirely according to those contexts is dangerous. I would also say that what's quite important is that where I think development is important is that children, of course, need to have that nurturance at different stages. And that's really quite key and important. And it's important that the notion of evolving capacities should be accepted. And clearly if you're going to treat a 3-year-old like a 16-year-old or like a 50-year-old man, that is wrong because of the element of evolving capacities. But I wouldn't like to emphasize with the 3-year-old the lack of evolvement. I'd like to work with the beginning bit, which is what they have and their personhood, which I think is more important, particularly if it's been expressed in a whole range of the Bill of Rights and a whole diet of rights, which it is. Thank you. Did you work three days on that question, did you? Okay. Okay.
This isn't an awkward question. I don't think I need this.
Oh, you do, because people can't hear you at the back, Franco.
Okay, it's a very simple question, really. I mean, I found your exposition fascinating. Why do adults forget that they were once children? That's my question.
Wow. I don't know how to answer that, Franco. I mean, I think it is and it isn't. I mean, in some respects, it isn't, because actually some of the problems arise, Franco, that we look into our childhood, and I think when I was researching children, I found this quite a difficult task, actually, because I remember what my childhood was like, and I think I know what the experience of childhood is, but it's a different age and a different context and a different person. And what I feel is the really exciting thing about the current social working and studying with children about and talking about childhood is that it is completely new, it is completely different, it is completely fascinating. And I think there's a real problem with research as a methodological problem of trying to impose our agendas, which very often happen in childhood, onto what we're looking and understanding. And I think that's actually probably an obstacle, isn't it, to providing good quality research and understanding and verstehen than was implied by your question. But it is a difficult dilemma.
Thank you, it's very interesting presentation. It's a comment rather than a question. It will be interesting, you mentioned the quality of the research, to have some child behavior studies in the early age, you mentioned age 3, and then followed by another age, and see how this will reflect in their future behavior. I think I saw a program on BBC some years ago. They followed a group of children from school to college to universities until they become adults, and there's a wide, diverse range of whatever happening in their lifestyle and in their life future as well. The other element of it is the inheritance. How effective is their parents? Because through the DNA, whatever you copied, your father, your mother, whether the girls or the boy. So it's a dynamic, interesting research to see how this behavior and how this will reflect into social studies, citizenship, and so on. Because media has an important effect as well. I know the TVs and the time, peak time and off time, especially with problem on danger life. So it's just a comment. Thank you.
I think it's a really interesting comment, because what I think, again, there's more about touching issues which you can go into far more depth about, which I didn't have time, and I ran over time in any case that I'd hoped. The idea of generation and generational justice is really, really important and key to understanding citizenship and life. And I think when we're looking towards the future, we have got a really, really interesting, fascinating kind of experiment that's occurring within the UK and other Western countries, but I think particularly the UK, and that is around housing and inheritance. And this won't necessarily affect children as such, but in societal measures, we're going to have people who in the same as siblings that we, or in a very similar kind of context, not siblings, but a similar group of people, one of whom could inherit their parents' house, which could be, on average, is around about $250,000, isn't it? So having $250,000 capital given to a person A and not given to person B, if that dynamic's running out over a couple of generations, you're going to have some very, very significant issues around social justice there, and the continuation of inequalities and so on. And I don't think we're beginning to get our head away, because that's just beginning to kind of take off. But and that's just one of the ways, I think, in which kind of intergenerational aspects of justice happens. So thank you for that.
Hi. Just one response to Franco's question, actually, is I think we tend to forget that troubled adults were children once. Mm-hmm. Hence the furore over the Bernardo's adverts of some years ago, which were quite shocking, precisely because we don't think of them in that kind of way. But my question is really, from my personal perspective at the moment, it seems that these inequalities, these class inequalities that are becoming increasingly embedded in childhood in Britain. So obviously nursery education, it seems to me that at primary school age, increasingly that top fifth in economic terms, there's almost an exodus at either 7 or 8 or 11 into private education, or that minority of selective state schools. And there's quite a lot which are selective, so obviously taking that ability, taking into account the abilities of children who often actually sit exams, and also that round of clubs that children from a very young age become involved in, which actually, aside from, say, Brownie's Scout movement, is very expensive. That whole different class-based level of opportunities to develop and experience a broader world that's very class-based. Is that getting worse, or is that something, clearly it's led by commercial aspects, since much of that we're probably of a similar age. In the 70s, I never went to that round of clubs. There wasn't the money, and there wasn't a level of expectation in class terms, but I think that's very much there now.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, there's an element of that, and I know it's not what you were implying at all, Alison, and it's very much the caricature of the tiger mum. I don't know if you're familiar with that concept, and of this mum that takes marches their child around these various things. And again, it's no accident that it's a woman as well. There's no tiger dads, and of course they do exist, that kind of, perhaps even more so, that drag their children around those clubs. And you're absolutely right, I think. And what I think is I'd answer that by a point I didn't have time to develop when I was talking about, the inequalities and well-being, is that well-being and poor well-being in the UK is experienced by all children. All children feel really stressed and unhappy, not just class. We don't know that we haven't got the kind of measurement. We can suspect that there'll be ideas of experiencing well-being and poorer well-being outcomes by poorer children. But what's very, very apparent is even those rich people are really, really frightened of these inequalities. So that's why they're marching their children around these different things, because they fear what may happen in this unequal society. If there wasn't such a big fall, they wouldn't be doing that kind of thing. And again, I don't know whether there may have been, tiger dads in 1970, mine weren't, so it's different. But I think we're probably more keen and associated because perhaps the risks are greater now.
So how do we combat that? We're not to do that, and we accept, we have a lower tolerance to risks probably now than we ever had before in lots of different ways.
I would respond to that by saying it's got to be through notions of making children's rights real to them and letting them embody that. Those children that you're referring to are perhaps not empowered at this moment in time. And I think what children's rights is not a reality for them, because they will possibly be choosing to do other things. So it's about expressing that and how that's expressed in terms of their family environments, that I would respond to that. But I think it's got to be the only way, is empowering children.
Okay, question at the end there, yeah.
Thanks for that. Just looking at the first couple of slides, and it sort of locates me at a very similar age to you with all your toys. I think the difference is that I don't remember them being rubbish toys as such. I quite enjoyed some of those toys. The one that you did leave off, and it was Action Man, who had his 50th birthday last week. I had quite a lot of Action Man, and in hindsight, quite a few of them were disabled as well. I don't think that's how they came in the box, though. I think that had a little bit more to do with me and my brother. I mean, the one thing you kind of allude to there is how childhood has changed. And you mentioned, things like bikes and different toys, and how we've moved away from outdoor play to indoors, away from the physical rubbish toys, you call them, to computers and games and so and thinking how some of those things and the United Nations poverty report and so on all kind of feed into a broader, kind of well-trodden discourse now that childhood is in a state of crisis. And that's led to parents and adults being more fearful of children. And it's interesting that United Nations article number 15 kind of almost encapsulates that. That children's worlds have shrunk in many ways. We don't let children roam as far away from the home or play on the streets and so on. And in a sense, the kind of world of lived citizenship that you're advocating is very far removed from the sort of almost a discursive reality where childhood is something to be, or children are something to be feared and kept out of sight and so on. So I just wonder what your thoughts on how you know, how do we sort of facilitate that movement from where we are now to where you would like to be, and what role do you see children and young people playing in that process?
Seizing the apparatus, I think, Dave. Well, first of all, I'm going to respond by saying, in terms of your first observation, that I take it, Dave, you don't play on computer games now. You do. Okay. And you know, I don't know, the FIFA games and all the others, you know, Grand Theft Auto, and they are pretty good games, and I can, you know, I'm glad George isn't here, because I do sometimes spend a lot of time on them. But anyhow, in terms of the main point about how to change attitudes, I don't know. I mean, I'll have as much of an idea as you will, Dave. I mean, I will kind of have what I think is the minimum. You know, getting hold of the media and so on is very, very difficult. And some people have talked about some of the voluntary organisations, and there's sometimes a danger with that, with the way they express and present children in terms of doing good, because sometimes that presents them even more of a victim, which reinforces the fear that you have, Dave. My same point is the same that I've answered to Alison. It's got to be about, the answer's got to reside with children themselves. It's got to be about how they understand themselves, how they're able to initiate and process those notions of rights, citizenship and belonging, which I think are really quite key to that. And that's the way I think would be the most sustainable way of moving forward, which doesn't really, it's not going to happen tomorrow.
I think it's time for maybe one last question. The lady in black in the middle.
Thank you, Tom. You identified some of the limitations of the UNCRC. Universalist, relies on developmental principles, usually requires adults to interpret whether children have those rights. Mm-hmm. Is not the fundamental problem with the UNCRC that it isn't legally binding? And as sociologists of childhood, instead of promoting the UNCRC, maybe we should be looking at things like the European Convention on Human Rights, which has been incorporated into legislation, doesn't other children sees them as human beings, and has actually been used really successfully to realise children's rights, particularly in the area of sexuality. And I just wonder whether we should be shifting towards that.
And it's also under threat, isn't it, by this current government, Alison? Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I guess it's there's some of the things around the way I'd respond to that is that, yes, you're absolutely right. It is the thing that's legally binding. It's the thing where the conversations are. It's not something that's written specifically for children, but it's about, and it also has its own set of problems as an expression of rights, like rights do. The UN Convention can be picked apart far easier precisely because it does say that this is for children. Now that's part of othering and all the rest of it. But if you're looking at something like the right of association, under the discourses, the European Convention of Human Rights and the Human Rights Act as it is in the UK, the idea that this is applicable to children isn't on the books, really. Now, it has been used in terms of issues around sexuality, I completely agree, and you can take someone to court over an aspect of the Human Rights Act, but you can't over the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child. Is absolutely right. Very, very significant. Thank you for that. That's another lecture, that. Well.
I know I said that would be the last question. I think we did have someone in the middle down here who's been waiting very patiently. 2 or 3 rows down. Who's been waiting very patiently.
Thank you. I wanted to say that for me, the most poignant part of your lecture today was the realization of a sort of self-advocacy in the part of the child through the child's voice. However, the part that I find most challenging in my work is if we're giving that voice in research on childhood, ultimately we're requesting consent from adults. So I wonder how we could overcome that if children are still children up to a particular age, that we define them then from thereafter as adults who can make that consent their own. So really, is it their voice? Are they participating as entities with their own individuality and identity?
I agree, yes. And I think I completely agree with you, because actually there's been other times where I think, where I've been part of ethics committee at another university, won't mention which said that you should never do research on children, okay? I've responded by that, which I think is what you're saying, is that actually we have a right to be researched, don't we? We also, it's rather similar, like, you know, black communities would say, well, actually we have a right to be policed, you know. And I just add that to your voice, that it's an infringement of children's rights, in my opinion, in terms of their lived expressions of living, of who they are and what they want to do. And actually, we know that there are very often the times when parents do not give their consent for children. There's a problem there, you know. Thank you.
Well, it's my great pleasure to give the vote of thanks this evening, and I think as one of our questions pointed out, for those of us of a certain age, we can recall all too well some of those games and toys that Tom reminded us of from the 1970s and the 1980s. But as he's also pointed out, although technological change may have altered a lot, in terms of childhood experience, there are still many issues that haven't gone away. Issues like infant mortality, child poverty, and a lack of a sense of well-being. And like Tom, I was very much struck by just how much of what he had to say this evening chimes so well with what Kate Pickett was saying only a couple of nights ago on Tuesday, about the very direct relationship between levels of inequality and levels of unhappiness and levels of poor health. And as Thomas pointed out also in his lecture, Edge Hill as a university does have a long and proud tradition of putting the needs of children at the forefront of its research. And in addition to all those departments in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences that Tom mentioned, of course we also have research going on in that area in this, our Faculty of Health and Social Care, and of course also in our Faculty of Education. I guess that all of us, when we watch the television sometimes and we hear academics talking about their areas of research expertise, sometimes think to ourselves, what is it about that subject that makes that person, that researcher, so attracted to it, that makes them so dedicated to that subject area? And I think Tom this evening in his lecture has given us a very eloquent explanation about why he feels so passionately as he does about the research that he undertakes, and why it is so important in our present-day society. Now, I'm sure Tom will be happy to take further questions outside about his lecture this evening, which I'm sure you'll agree with me, has been very thought-provoking and stimulating. And we do have some refreshments for you to help lubricate the discussion as well. But before we partake of those, I'd like to invite you to join with me once again to thank Tom for his very challenging lecture tonight.